feel I have gained a better understanding of how this world has been inverted and corrupted by satanic powers. It's obvious Satan cannot create things, but he can copy or mimic what already exists. This is all Satan has been able to do, and so over time his inversions get farther and farther from the original source. They become a copy of a copy. There are many examples of this, and I intend to point out several of them. In part 2 of this series, I showed that when making 24 equally spaced points circling Metatron's cube, and then writing the Fibonacci sequence on the points, 2 sets of 3, 6, and 9 appears on the points forming the triangles. There is a right side up triangle with a 3, 6, 9, and an upside down triangle with a 3, 6, 9. At this time, I will point out several more things that I found interesting about writing the Fibonacci sequence around Metatron's cube. When looking at the top 5 numbers and the bottom 5 numbers, we can see that they are reversed. On the top, we can see 81911, and on the bottom, we see 88981. It also seems that when adding together the corresponding numbers and using the method of reducing the total down to the root number, you will most likely end up with 3, 6, or 9. When adding together the top 5 numbers going across the circle, which are again 81911, you will end up with the master number 11, or 2. And when adding together the bottom 5 numbers, which are 88981, and are an inversion of the top 5 numbers, you end up with 7 as the root number. When adding the root number from the top 5 numbers, which is 2, and the root number from the bottom 5 numbers, which is 7, you end up with 9. Even if you keep the total of the top 5 numbers as master number 11 instead of 2, it still works. 11 plus 7 is 18, and 1 plus 8 is 9. Now that we've accounted for the top and bottom 5 numbers, let's look at the rest of the numbers. Looking at the numbers that correspond on the left and the right side of the form, starting with 2 on the left and another 2 on the right. The sum of those 2 numbers is 4. Keep that in mind as we move on. Below that, we have the bottom of the inverted triangle, and the corresponding numbers are obviously 6 on the left and 3 on the right. The sum of these 2 numbers is 9. Keep that in mind. The next set of corresponding numbers is 5 on the left and another 5 on the right. Added together is 10, and reduced to 1 digit, you end up with 1. Below that, we have 1 on the left and 8 on the right, which equals 9. Below that, 4 on the left and 4 on the right, which equals 8. Below that is the bottom of the right side up triangle, 6 on the left and 3 on the right, which equals 9. And below that, we have the last set of corresponding numbers we are accounting for, 7 on the left and 7 on the right, which is 14, and becomes 5. When we add together each of the reduced numbers, 4 plus 9 plus 1 plus 9 plus 8 plus 9 plus 5, it equals 45. Then 4 plus 5 is 9. And so we see how when accounting for every number in the sequence, it all reduces back to 9. It almost seems like 9 could possibly represent God in some way. Everyone has heard of the Holy Trinity, which is obviously 3. 9 is a trinity of trinities, or 3 times 3. However, it is important to keep in mind that there could be 2 versions of the number 9. As we know, the numbers 3, 6, and 9 govern the spiritual realm, But we can also see that when the golden ratio is written around Metatron's cube, two sets of 3, 6, and 9 appear. One is upright and the other is inverted. So it's quite possible that there is an evil or inverted version of the numbers 3, 6, and 9, as well as a good version. And so if all the numbers written around Metatron's cube reduce back to 9, and we know that Metatron's cube could be a creation of Satan, or at least a distortion of God's creation, then maybe the 9 that is reducing down to is in fact the inverted 9. While looking deeper into the Fibonacci sequence and where it originates from, I learned that there is actually a different sequence that could be more true to God's original creation. This sequence is called the Kathara or crystal, spiral, or grid. The reason why people believe that the Kathara grid is closer to God's creation is because it stays connected to the 0 point, or the source. The Fibonacci sequence works by adding the previous number in the sequence to the current number, and that gives you the next number. And with the Kathara or crystal sequence, you add every previous number to the current number, and that gives you the next number. And so we can see that with the Kathara sequence, it always includes the 0 point, and so it is always able to stay connected to the source. Whereas with the Fibonacci sequence, it only adds the last two numbers, and so it progressively gets farther away from the source, sort of like becoming a copy of a copy. In part 2, I explained that I believe it's possible God initially created the universe in the form of vortex math, and that Satan inverted what God created, which overlaid an upside down triangle over vortex math and became Metatron's cube. Is it possible then that the Kathara or crystal grid is associated with vortex math, and the Fibonacci sequence is associated with Metatron's cube? I have touched upon the idea that technology has been utilized by satanic powers to construct the matrix. I believe it could be possible that artificial intelligence has been part of this matrix in some way for quite some time, and I certainly believe it's possible that AI could be controlled by demonic forces. If AI were to create other robots, then that would be an example of something being a copy of a copy, or something that is progressively getting farther away from the original. Supposedly, this is what the Fibonacci sequence, or golden ratio, does. It gets farther away from the source the farther it goes. Something I found interesting that relates to that idea, and that I mentioned in a previous video, is Enoch from the line of Seth is 7th from Adam, and Lamech from the line of Cain is 7th from Adam, or possibly the devil. Lamech was said to have been the father of the 4 children that constructed the 2 pillars with wisdom and knowledge inscribed in them. One of those children is a highly venerated character in Freemasonry named Tubal-Cain. Lamech was also said to have killed Cain, his grandfather, as well as his son, Tubal-Cain. Enoch, from the line of Seth, was obviously an enlightened person who is said to have walked with God. And so it's sort of like Enoch was the very best and Lamech was the very worst. They were both 7th from Adam, and it's obvious that the number 7 has significance. In an octave, there are really only 7 main notes, and the 8th note is actually the beginning of the next octave. And so 7 is sort of like the farthest you can go in one direction until there's a whole new level. Enoch went in the good direction and Lamech went in the bad direction. And it seems like this is possible for everyone. We can all choose which direction we want to go. We can descend or ascend. We can get farther away from the source, or we can return to the source. After learning about the Kathara sequence, I decided to write it around Metatron's cube, the same way I wrote the Fibonacci sequence around Metatron's cube. First, I had to figure out what each of the 24 numbers were going to be after I reduced them down to a single digit. After writing about 7 or 8 rows of the Kathara sequence, I realized that it is just doubling every time. And after figuring out the reduced number for all 24 numbers, I noticed that it makes a pattern that repeats. 1, 2, 4, 8, 7, 5. And when you add together all the numbers in the pattern, you end up with 27. 2 plus 7 is 9. Similar things happen between both the Kathara and Fibonacci sequence when applying them to Metatron's cube. For instance, the top 5 numbers and bottom 5 numbers are nearly perfect inversions of each other with the Kathara sequence, very similar to what we saw with the Fibonacci sequence. Numbers across from each other do interesting things as well. What I found most fascinating about the Kathara sequence around Metatron's cube is that the 4 points that make the cross are all the number 7. I'm sure there are other patterns to be found, but I decided to try something else, because I realized that since the Metatron's cube could be the incorrect or false model, I would need to write the Kathara sequence around Vortex math, because then it would be the correct sequence with the correct model. And so I drew the Vortex math form with 18 points around it. I made 18 points because Metatron's cube is based on 12 circles around a center point, and when doubling 12 you get 24, which is why when writing the Fibonacci sequence around Metatron's cube you would make 24 points, and when doing so the numbers 3, 6, 9 appear on the points forming the triangles, as well as other interesting things. And so I figured it would make the most sense to double the 9 points around Vortex math and write the Kathara sequence on 18 points surrounding the Vortex math form. When doing so, I discovered something interesting. In Vortex math, the numbers 3, 6, and 9 are said to govern the spiritual realm, and the numbers 1, 2, 4, 5, 7, and 8 are said to govern the physical realm. Remembering that odd numbers are considered to be masculine and spiritual, and even numbers are considered to be feminine and material, and the number 1 is androgynous, we can see that out of the numbers that govern the physical realm, there are more even numbers than odd, which makes sense. And the 2 odd numbers, 7 and 5, when added together make 12, which becomes 3, a spiritual number. And out of the numbers that govern the spiritual realm, 3, 6, and 9, the only even number is 6. I find this fascinating because of how often 6 is referred to in occult writings, as well as the many other things involving the number 6. It seems fitting that 6 would be the number that is both spiritual and physical. When you have the Kathara sequence written around Vortex math, and when you account for all the numbers in a certain order, you end up with the number 3 as a total or root number, perhaps representing the Holy Trinity. The most noticeable thing, and perhaps one of the most interesting, is that the number 7 appears on the 3 points forming the triangle, as opposed to the number 7 forming the cross when the Kathara sequence was written around Metatron's cube. If you multiply the 3 7s forming the triangle, you get 21. 2 plus 1 is 3. Keep that in mind as we move on. Now that we've accounted for the points where the spiritual numbers would be, let's account for the points that make up the physical numbers. And interestingly, all the points where the physical numbers would be on Vortex math all become 1 and 4 when the Kathara sequence is written around the form. And so you can see there are 3 sets of the numbers 1 and 4 on the physical points. 1 plus 4 is 5. Multiplied by 3 is 15. 1 plus 5 is 6. So we have the spiritual number 6 that is also feminine, meaning that it is also technically physical as well. And this number is what you get when all the physical points are added up and reduced. And then we just have the remaining numbers, the in-between points of Vortex math. And so we add the corresponding numbers on the left side to the right side. First we have 8 and 1, which is 9. Next we have 2 and 2, which is 4. Then 5 and 8, which is 13, which is 4. Then we have 8 and 5, which is another 4. And lastly, we add together top and bottom, which is 7 on top and 2 on bottom, which is 9. Now we add together all the numbers. 9 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 9 equals 30, which is 3. So the root number for the spiritual points is 3, and the root number for the physical points is 6, and the root number for the remaining numbers is 3. 3 plus 6 plus 3 is 12, and 1 plus 2 is 3. And so when accounting for all the numbers, we get 3, or maybe the Holy Trinity. 3 would technically be the first masculine or spiritual number. And apparently, according to Pythagoras, numbers didn't even start until 3. I mentioned earlier that the pattern the Kathara sequence makes is 1, 2, 4, 8, 7, 5. And that when added together, you get 9. I've heard before that 9 is sacred to man, and that 1 is God. I believe 9 could be sacred to man, but is it possible that God is actually 3 and not 1? Because we know the number 1 is androgynous. Satanists worship an androgynous idol, and many New Age beliefs push the idea that God is androgynous. We know that 3 is masculine and spiritual, and we know that our thoughts, which come from the spiritual realm, are what create the physical realm. And so to me, it makes sense that God would be masculine and spiritual because God created everything, and God is the Holy Trinity. Many Christians subscribe to the belief that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are all one being manifesting in 3 ways, similar to how the numbers 3, 6, and 9 all govern the spiritual realm. Something else that is interesting is that the golden ratio is associated with something called a biwave, which is also known as the Vesica Piscis. And the Kathara sequence is associated with something called a trinized wave, which is basically the Vesica Piscis with a third circle. And so we see that the Fibonacci sequence is based off 2 circles, and the Kathara sequence is based off 3 circles. The word sin means to fall short or miss the target. And so the Fibonacci sequence falls short because it is lacking the third circle. Something else that is associated with the Fibonacci sequence and the Kathara sequence is the Sephiroth tree and the Kathara tree. On the Sephiroth tree, there are 10 circles or points, and we know that when 10 is reduced, it's 1. On a Kathara tree, there are 12 circles or points, and we know 12 becomes 3 when reduced. So there's 2 more examples of the number 3 being associated with the Kathara sequence and possibly Vortex math. Another thing that I believe could be connected to Vortex math are the 9 solfeggio frequencies or notes. Supposedly, when the original music scale was discovered, there were a total of 9 core creative frequencies, and so some people believe that everything in the universe is made up of 9 notes. When mapping out the 9 frequencies, it creates a form made up of 3 triangles. One thing I noticed is that each triangle on the form has variations of the same number on its points. One triangle has variations of 417, one with 528, and one with 639. You'll notice that the frequency 528 is on there twice, one on the outside circle and the other in the center. 528 is known as a love frequency, and it is often associated with the heart chakra. Knowing that heart is an anagram for earth, and we see 528 in the center, similar to where Mount Meru would be on the flat earth model, perhaps it's possible that this has something to do with the placement of the earth. The first thing I thought to do when seeing the 9 solfeggio frequencies mapped out was to reduce all the frequencies down to their root number and see which numbers end up on each point. And when doing so, something interesting happens. You end up with 3 sets of 369, or a trinity of 369. Is it possible that this could somehow represent the Holy Trinity? Something else that is interesting about the form created by mapping out the frequencies is that it is identical to Vortex math. If you compare both forms, you'll notice that the points perfectly match, and the points that would be the spiritual on Vortex math are all variations of 639 on the solfeggio form. And if the universe was made of 9 frequencies, maybe that is what Vortex math is, and now it has been distorted into Metatron's cube. I recently stumbled across a video of someone showing Vortex math drawn as a cube. The form is essentially 2 cubes stacked together. The first thing I noticed when seeing this is that it nearly is identical to the Kathara tree. However, in his presentation, he only drew the 10 points that make up the 2 cubes. And below the form, he wrote the sum of each row of numbers. I realized in order to make 12 points like the Kathara tree has, all I would need to do is add a point above and below the top and bottom circles, which would mean the number that would be in the 2 new circles would be the sum total of only the middle row. And when adding together all the numbers in the middle row, you end up with 18, which becomes 9 when reduced. I simply added them together from top to bottom and bottom to top, which gives you 2 9s, one on top and one on bottom. Then you just connect the 2 new points to the rest of the form. And when you do this, it perfectly resembles the Kathara tree. In the video, he goes on to show how the patterns with the numbers in the Vortex math circle perfectly mirror the number patterns in the cube form. And he essentially confirms that the cube formation is indeed the same as Vortex math, which would mean that the Kathara or crystal sequence is associated with Vortex math. I'll leave a link to this video in the description because he He points out a lot of other things that will take too long to explain, but I will mention one more thing that I found interesting about this information. When looking at the double cube or Kathara tree formation and reading the numbers from top to bottom, you can see in each row one of the solfeggio frequencies: 174, 369, and 258. And we know that it's possible that these are the frequencies that created everything in the universe. Obviously, much of this is speculation, but I definitely believe this is an interesting topic that I have most likely barely scratched the surface of.